Well, it's 12:05, so we'll do a slow start and hopefully we'll have a few more people joining us today. I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Rhiannon Klein, and I'm the chair and an instructor in the Indigenous Governance degree program here at Yukon University. And we're very excited to be launching this brand new Indigenous Governance degree speaker series. So this semester, we'll be having four talks, starting with the one today with Gillian Staveley, followed by another one later this month on October 26th with Dr. Samantha Darling. And she'll be focusing on the capacity behind the decision, so the role of research capacity in impact assessment. So focusing on some of the work she recently did for her PhD. And then we'll have another talk in November, followed by the last one for this series in December. And we're hoping to expand out the series again starting in January. I would like to just start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Ta'an Quechin Council, and I feel very honored that I live, work, and play on these beautiful lands. And we're joined by people on a number of different traditional territories today, so it's exciting to see the diversity of people who've joined us for today's talk. And I would like to pass it over and introduce our special guest today, Gillian Staveley, who is teaching for us in the Indigenous Governance degree, and we're very excited to see her presentation today. So over to you, Gillian.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Hello, everyone. Dinta. Yes, happy to be with you all here today. It's a sunny day here in Faro where I live and work, so I'm happy to be able to be tuning in virtually to you all, wherever you call home. My home is Denikaya, which is known as the People's Country, and it's the Kaska Dena traditional territory, of which I'm a part of ancestrally. My family has been part of the communities that encompass our nation, where we've lived, thrived, and created a culture in these homelands. And I'm connected to these lands through my mother, who I believe is even on the Zoom here today. We're part of a long line of matriarchs who have focused on advancing our culture and our language and our traditional education practices, and at the root of it all, defending the land. So I grew up as a daughter of land stewards who got to be connected to Denikaya from a Dene perspective. So that's really shaped me as a person and has guided me in the work that I'm doing today with the Kaska and with my nation, and the work that I'm doing with an incredible team of people is on focusing on our vision of Kaska. And what we're really focusing on a lot right now is advancing one of our Indigenous protected and conserved area proposals for our nation. So I'll call it an IPCA for short. Some of you may be familiar with that lingo. Everything about our proposal is centered on who we are as Kaska. So it's really lovely to be able to live and breathe what IPCAs are all about, and why they're so important. And that's something I'm really looking forward to be sharing with you all today, is the importance of this form of Indigenous resurgence, and why IPCAs are something we all should be looking at and interested in, especially those of us who are connected with Indigenous-led conservation and reconciliation. So for those who may not know who the Kaska are, we are an unceded nation of people who have lived in our ancestral lands since time immemorial. And our traditional territory is quite large. It's around 240,000 square kilometers of landscape, around 24 million hectares, which is quite a large area. You could compare it to the state of Oregon. We're one of the largest Indigenous nations in Canada by size of our territory. And we encompass about 25% of the Yukon, 10% of BC, and then a smaller portion of Western Northwest territories. And the Kaska are a nation and a group of people that are connected through our language and our culture and our traditions, where there's a very high degree of mutual intelligibility within our dialects, within our traditional territory. So the Kaska Dena nations in BC are the Dease River First Nation in Good Hope Lake, the Daly Dene Council in Lower Post, and the Quadacha First Nation in Fort Ware. And on the Yukon side of the border, the Kaska communities reside in the communities of Ross River and Watson Lake, administered by Ross River Dene Council and the Liard First Nation. So just to give a picture of who we are and where we are geographically. The Kaska, as a nation, are a group of people who have cared for our territory for thousands of years. And our history goes back much further than we could possibly date. So we never like to focus on those things. But if you do look back in the archaeological record, people have been in regions of Denikaya for over 8,000 years. And we've been focusing a lot on documenting our connection to these places, especially since the 1980s. And we've recorded over 18,000 Kaska cultural sites, dwelling sites, trail networks, just on the BC portion of Kaska Dena traditional territory. And half of those sites are captured in our proposed conservation area that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So just to further characterize our connection to Denikaya, around 80% of our traditional territory meets title as defined by the Supreme Court of Canada. And as a people, we have been able to show that continuous historical and cultural connection, which makes us the unceded nation we are today. And that's something that's been affirmed and recognized by all levels of government. But more importantly, I think it is essential to characterize how the Kaska have a very similar historical and current day social reality that fits the picture of many Indigenous nations in Canada who have dealt with our history of colonization and colonial oppression. And it's really those forces of colonization that really divided us as a community, as a nation. There was borders drawn that fragmented our territory. We were imposed by new place names, and other people besides ourselves were making decisions for our lands. And they really worked to undermine Kaska knowledge systems. And we really know we're at a time in our lives now where we have to dismantle that system. We need to start creating space to hold Indigenous ways of understanding for the survival of our communities and our nation. So collectively, we've started restoring our faith and knowing that the answer to Kaska Dena people's survival lies in our culture and in our spiritual understandings and our land-based connections that make us who we are. So the work that I've been doing with Denikaya Institute, which is a Kaska run non-for-profit and charitable organization, is to focus on our mandate to not just preserve our culture, but to live it and breathe it into our communities. And so that's why we're really focused on advancing our land guardian network and our proposed IPCA. Our IPCA is called Dene Kusān, and it represents the heart of our ancestral lands in British Columbia, which also happens to support one of the largest intact landscapes in the province. And we call it Denikaya Kusān, which in our language means that we as Kaska and our laws and our language and our land will always be here. And as long as we are here and our culture and our values are here, that is what we're trying to protect through this Indigenous-led conservation initiative. And it's how we honor the ways of our people and our ethics and our laws, that desire to protect our culture and our land, because we know that as long as we are here and our ways of knowing are here, it's all tied together. And it's a very important message to share with others, but also with ourselves within our nation. And it's something quite important, I think, this idea that it's going to take all of us to work towards this vision as Dene people, and protecting the land is who we are as Dene. It's central to who we are, and it's really an initiative that has the opportunity to make us whole again. So the map you see represents Denikaya Kusān, and it is more than just a place in a region, right? It is a cultural storehouse for our people. But in terms of size, it's around 40,000 square kilometers of land and water that's completely free of roads and development. And it's those ecosystems in this area that have really nourished our communities for millennia. And because it is quite a large scale conservation area, it has the opportunity to be a very significant contribution to the climate targets that we're trying to make in Canada. So just to explain the map a little bit more, the purple is our proposed conservation area, and the green is existing protected areas within the province. So we're wanting to provide that connectivity piece between the existing anchors that already are there that make up the Wide corridor And you can just see the scope and size of that we're trying to do within British Columbia. Yeah. So the Kaska Dena vision for Denikaya Kusān, is really based on our concentric vision for the future. And visioning is a hugely important commonality in IPCAs across Canada because they're based on the strategic shared visions of the nations that put them forward. So our vision for our IPCA is really rooted in our sacred duties and responsibilities that our members feel they have towards Denikaya. It's that ethical responsibility that we feel that we have because we're tied to those lands. And without them, our well-being personally, as well as our culture, has risk of being jeopardized. So you see a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada, they're really pushing and challenging the buried colonial epistemologies that have really disassociated us from our culture and our Indigenous identity and our language and our lands. And as a result, that's why you're seeing these very innovative approaches about mapping attachment back to certain landscapes, because we know that the restoration of Indigenous values is what's so important so that we can combat those colonial management strategies and counteract that settler dialogue so that it can be more fulsome if it's Indigenous-led. So part of our work is reclaiming who we are through our laws as well. And we know that we've developed really strong ethics by our ways of knowing, being stewards of these lands. And it's making sure that we can maintain and restore the conditions of our ancestral lands that make us who we are. And I believe that Indigenous nations know that that's the way of the future. Our future really must have resiliency and reconnection. So our strong vision for our communities is one that focuses on that, focuses on community vitality and environmental preservation. So we know that it's about ensuring that the ecological habitat that we're trying to protect is as resilient as our people, especially in the face of climate change. And that's something we're all dealing with together collectively in this country. So it really is a good post-pandemic path for us because it's focusing on healing and rooting our values to the lands once again. And it's our relationship to the land that's essential for us, for all of us, as we collectively battle the realities and hardships of COVID, right? So I really like to see it as us trying to plant a seed for regrowth and recovery and reconnection. And IPCAs really can make that possible. I think that we have a lot of goals based on this vision of protecting our culture and our land. But at the end of the day, we really have a lot of pieces within that are equally as important. We want to see the restoration of our community's presence on the land, and we want to see the revitalization of those practices and the transmission of knowledge from our elders to our youth. We want to see our families strengthened on the land, and that we see an emergence of our traditional cultural and social institutions within the land as well. But we know that we need short and long-term funding to make that happen. And it has to be something that's based on sustainable economies. So, when I think about our overall motivation for our IPCA, it really is for us to be able to preserve our way of life and reclaim our customary laws, but also reclaim our role as land stewards. And in order to do that, we have to be focusing on economies that are perhaps outside the box. We know that we have to achieve a balanced understanding of how we can live in our world today. We have to be practical and pragmatic. So when you think about the elements that create a meaningful existence today for Indigenous peoples, it really focuses on our land and our culture and our communities. So if we can focus on the regeneration of our communities around land-based practices, we can start rebuilding those autonomous social and cultural existences and self-sufficient economies on the land. And the proof is there. Investing in Indigenous conservation can create a very resilient economy. And it is possible for us to conserve our lands and also grow our economy at the same time. And you're seeing governments starting to witness this and understand this as well. that IPCAs can be a very hugely effective way for us to achieve our conservation goals, and also recognize how Indigenous people play a vital role in sustaining the lands and waters that we all depend on. And that's why IPCAs are a really important reconciliation partnership that's very much needed in this country, because it allows us to elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities through a very modern application of traditional values and Indigenous knowledge systems, especially within management plans and boards that ensure that landscapes are protected. So it's really part of the important redress that can occur through reconciliation. And I think it's about acknowledging and learning from the past, but also knowing that we have to build a better future. And reconciliation needs to be seen as Canadian vision, which I think we're starting to see that, where there's that mutual respect and recognition. That's why we've always seen IPCAs as being an opportunity for reconciliation, because it is the use and the occupation of our lands within our traditional territories where we can really reestablish and rebuild and reorient our cultures and our communities, right? So through the heritage that the Kaska have to these places, we can start using our Indigenous knowledge to help us build better management strategies around lands and really promote that idea of sustainable communities, because we can use our unique interests and priorities in environmental stewardship and allow for the land and water centered protection be based on a variety of conservation measures that are Indigenous-led. And it's really our hope that through this reconciliation shift that we're seeing, we can really start to revitalize and reconcile our relationship to the land and to each other. And we can do that by building in Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being into conservation in Canada. Looking at it from a land protection initiative that's based on Indigenous laws and governance and knowledge systems, and therefore the culture and revitalization of Indigenous ways of knowing are really the heart and center of IPCAs, because we know that the laws that we have will guide a relationship as we continue to support this proposal. So, when I think about our laws for in the Kaska perspective, like many other Indigenous legal traditions, it's centered on our relationships. And we developed over time a sense of normative values and legal principles that grounded us to the earth. But unfortunately, many of the legal orders in our colonial history impacted that line that we have to our laws, that invisible connection that the Kaska Dena have to Dene and Kusān, for example, our spiritual laws. So we know that by reconnecting to our Indigenous legal orders, it's an approach that can be quite powerful. The resurgence of our laws can be that path to finding the healing amongst us personally, but also within our families, in our communities, in our nation. And that by focusing on Indigenous legal traditions, we're really helping address our current and future needs. We can start braiding our laws together to create a shared understanding of governance and decision-making over the lands and waters within Denikaya, and that the foundation of those is based on our Kaska ways of knowing, doing, and being. And by doing that, we will make sure that we have resilience, lands, and waters. So Denikaya Kusān, because it's such an intact wilderness landscape, we know that it already has the opportunity to help us fight the challenges we're having in our world today around impacts to biodiversity from climate change. But we also know that we have a way of understanding this land that can also help better keep those areas intact. And this has been more recently acknowledged. Some of you may know some of the literature around this, but around 2019, the United Nations Assessment of Biodiversity found that lands that were managed by Indigenous people tend to be healthier than other areas. And that's why we believe IPCAs, for example, will boost our ability to mitigate the effects of climate change in the North based on that recognition. So even still, people do tend to look at protection through that lens that strictly just shows the ecological protection that it can provide. But for our communities, we know that it's so much more than that. It's the right and the ability for us to exist freely and healthily as Indigenous peoples in our homelands. And it must be recognized and supported as a means of resurgence, because where we can help fight this climate crisis that we collectively have in our country is also where we as Kaska can heal our people. And it's a model for the future that's based on resilient lands and waters, because what is good for the land is good for all people. So we know that we really must focus on healing our communities to restore that balance of wellness. And that's why Denikaya Kusān is seen to us as this bulwark against future generations being dependent on establishments that are outside of our own. We know that we can start focusing more on our relationship to the land and what that means to us, and continually develop that relationship in a contemporary context, because we are very deeply rooted to the ecology of Denikaya. And we really are starting to see governments invest in this healing journey that we're on by developing the long-term capacity and capabilities that are needed for Indigenous communities to promote their land ethics. And that can come in many forms. But for us, it's having that long-term funding and capacity for our land guardian programs to be able to steward and represent the entities they want to protect. So when you think of IPCAs and land guardian programs, they're so connected, and they are a foundation of economic sustainability across the North. So when we look at Indigenous-led conservation strategies, we need to make sure that Canada's economic recovery is really rooted in equity and sustainability, so that we see more Indigenous-led proposals out there, because it will allow us to have healthier ecological outcomes on our lands, but economic ones as well. So I think a lot of people are always wondering, like, why now? Why is this such a big thing in our country right now? But I think it is important to mention that this is not a new phenomenon. We have been protecting our ancestral lands for millennia, but now we are at a place in time when people are listening and they're looking at the work that we're doing, and they're seeing the value. They're seeing these Indigenous communities come to the table with incredible proposals that are centered on their community's visions. And many of these proposals in our country are succeeding. While some are being met with the political realities of our lands being very value-laden and inherently political. So I think it's about turning that focus to not say what we might be preventing with protecting our landscapes and our cultures, but what we're giving ourselves. And that's the vision that our elders remind us, is for us to acknowledge that gift that we have in our landscapes, and it's something that we can share with the world. So when we're looking at our situation in Canada today, we're realizing that there's partnerships here. We're able to recover and create and reconcile and heal, and IPCAs really allow for that to happen. It allows for us to uphold our laws and our people and our land for a collective future in the North. And it's a future that's balanced spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, where our languages are strong and our land is strong and our relationships with government will be strong, because we're focusing on what brings us together versus what divides us. So, there's that mutual responsibility aspect here to make sure that our collective lands are healthy and sustainable, because if we're healthy, our lands are healthy, and vice versa. All of us, even on Zoom, are part of that outcome. And we really need to work together to ensure that happens. So, Denikaya Kusān, I'm talking about it in the context of it. It's an example. It's an example that I'm very passionate about, and very many of the wonderful women and people that I work with are passionate about it as well, because we know that we're trying to redefine our relationship to the land, but we're also trying to meet the needs of our country as a whole. And it's IPCAs as this concept that really allow our history to move us in a circle and bring us back to our traditions, but within a new way of understanding our ancestors' connection to our lands and waters, because we're creating our own connections to it. And that really allows us to renew our identity as the people, but also create a sense of future human agency, because we're restoring our values. And that is really what's helping guide the much needed restitution of our people to the land in our country. And inevitably, it will be the synchronicity of this restoration that will be determined by the leaders in our country, right, and their collective vision. But at the end of the day, the Kaska know that we will always be here. That's why we called it Denikaya Kusān. And we really want to protect this connection. But the better question we're asking people around us is, do you also want to see that? Do you also want to see that protection and sustainability and resiliency within the North? And yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. Kola, Shoasanla, and really looking forward to having maybe some fulsome discussion for the rest of the time that we have here together. So thanks, Rhiannon.
Thank you so much, Gillian. We certainly have some time, so we'd love to open it up to discussion or questions for Gillian. Feel free to raise your hand or type a question in the chat, or just unmute.
Yes, John Padamore here, Kwanlundan Heritage Lands and Resources Department. Just wanted to know if Gillian looked into those habitat protection area management plans that do exist for some First Nations that have a land claim agreement. Yeah, I haven't read any of them, so I'm just wondering if she found any of these concepts and philosophies she's talking about in any of them, because I kind of have my doubts, but there might be stuff like that in there. But it would be good if we did that, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a really good point. I think this whole notion of IPCAs, because it is rooted on Indigenous self-determination and UNDRIP, that a lot of existing protections that are out there and other models that are out there, whether they be in the Yukon or other places in the North, they're not at the level that we want to achieve within an IPCA around co-management and around the recognition of rights and title. So, you know, even though there might be communities with modern land claims or treaties where they're looking at different ways to protect their lands, I'd say that there's not one model that works for everyone. But for the Kaska, because we are in this unique situation where we are unceded and we're exploring reconciliation across the board, especially around governance, we know that any sort of model that we use to protect our lands has to be done with the highest level of UNDRIP, helping us achieve that vision. So co-management, co-authority, ensuring that Kaska's future is sustainable, while making sure that we also have a stake in the economic considerations as well around this landscape, and be able to mold it and identify what needs to be done. And, you know, traditional understandings around parks and protected areas, I think a lot of people get nervous because they think, oh, they're going to map us out of the land, you know, and we're trying to combat that by saying, no, we're going to put you in there. This is going to be your land. And we're going to find a way to create it and allow certain uses to exist so that we can remain whole as Kaska. So no, that's a good point. I think it is important to note that there are so many different models out there, and we're exploring which model works for us in British Columbia, knowing that there's obviously different jurisdictional situations being in BC compared to the Yukon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Does anyone else have a question or comment to open discussion?
Hello, this is Chris Thomas with Yukon Government. I'm just wondering, was there any reason or challenge why some of this could not be applied within Yukon territory? I noticed that it was interconnecting protected areas in to the south of the British Columbia border, but was there a challenge with that, or is it just not at this point in time that you're not pursuing it?
No, good question, Chris. Yeah, I think it just roots back to how IPCAs came about, because back in 2017, the federal ministers were really emphasizing that this can be a hugely important way for Canada to meet their protected areas targets. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for IPCAs. And that's why we saw this really great outpour of proposals. And there are quite a few proposals for IPCAs in the Yukon from different communities and nations. But there's still a lot of big questions around law and authority, and in what areas count as part of the pathway of Target 1, and how these areas are funded and monitored and enforced. And in BC, because we are looking at finding ways to implement DRIPA, the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples Act that BC has, that's really helping us figure out how IPCAs can be mandated. But as far as I know, the Yukon government has not mandated IPCAs or hasn't created any sort of legislation around them and what they can look like. Doesn't mean that that can't be done. It's just whether or not the government's interest is in doing that right now and changing how land use planning or land relationship planning is done. But I think for, if we had to look at it across the board, the challenge is showing decision makers why we need to do this. Getting that buy-in can be quite difficult. But I do think we have come a long way in trying to show them why it is important, and their responsibility and duty as well to implement what they say they will do around UNDRIP, and whatever mandate each government may have around reconciliation. So I wish I knew why these things aren't pushing forward in the way that people have hoped, but I don't think anyone's giving up, and everyone's giving each other the time to figure this out. But I think at the end of the day, if governments look to Indigenous nations and say, how do we do this? We'll be able to provide you the answer of what it looks like for us. But that's going to look different with every Indigenous community in the North. So not an easy job.
Did you have a follow-up at all, Chris? Oh, he says thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine it's challenging with transboundary issues.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to jump in.
One more comment from John here. This Done still actually has a chance. I mean, I realize it's more than just the name of the kind of conservation area, but we still have one habitat protection area that does not have a management plan for it. So I'm going to be passing some of these thoughts of yours, Gillian, and others to those folks. Like, we've got planning people and we've got stewardship people both. So just we could start working. Okay, and it's kind of for us, I think, for Quinlan Dunn to go to the government and say, we want to get started on this particular area to look after it better. It's all followed up with the hydro dams too. So we're just about to talk to Yukon Energy Corp about this. So we might be able to kind of morph habitat protection area towards what you've been saying. So see what happens there. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. And I would definitely, there are others on the Zoom that are looking at different ways to look at conservation. Back when with the original targets that Canada set out, there was a creation of I think they're called the Indigenous Circle of Experts that came out with various draft reports about what conservation could look like if it's Indigenous-led. And that report goes through a bunch of different options that exist in Canada, depending on your jurisdiction or what you're trying to harness. If it's more ecological protection that you're looking for, there's so many different opportunities out there. And some of the recent IPCAs that have been supported federally and more locally are connected to some of the newer national park connections around Indigenous governance and looking at ways to manage landscapes with that co-management piece very much tied in. So there's so many opportunities out there for Indigenous communities. They just have to find what fits for them, whether it's a national park or a tribal park or a conservancy, or maybe something that hasn't even been created yet, and something that can be explored further within the community and with governments that they need to be working with. So it feels like the box is open, and we just need to find a way to get governments to the table to show them that this is a good thing. As the sun comes pouring in here.
You're in a beam of light. Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, Gillian. Thanks for the talk. Nice to see you, by the way. I feel like I've known your name before the face, so it's nice to put a face to the name. I'm probably going to expose my level of ignorance on this topic with this question, but here goes anyway. It's sort of picking up on the answer you just gave, actually, which is, are the Kaska looking to examples elsewhere already where IPCA implementation has progressed further or is already having success even outside Canada, perhaps?
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to speak to that?
Absolutely, right? We call it IPCAs in Canada, but it's called different things throughout the globe. What roots it, I guess, is that it's Indigenous-led. That's what's different. And so when we look at other Indigenous-led initiatives out there, you can look to the Maori in Australia and really all over to find what connects with the inherent rights and responsibilities that Indigenous people feel to their lands. And there is definitely lots of wonderful examples out there that have various levels of protection and joint jurisdiction. And so we've definitely done our homework to look at those models and find out what Kaska need and what we are trying to be focusing on. And because we are looking at an area that has these connection pieces within Y2Y, we're trying to find a way to ensure that it's part of that work that's being done, but also that it becomes harnessed within Kaska understandings of the land. And that's, I guess, what makes us a little bit different, because every Indigenous community is going to have a different understanding, but there's some inherent commonalities too about our responsibility to the area, and ensuring that responsibility carries on beyond our own people, that it would be a responsibility we would want to uphold with anyone that visits Denikaya. And it's that shift that I think we're seeing in Canada, that it's this collective duty and that we all have a role in ensuring these areas are safeguarded from an ecological point of view, but also from a cultural one. So, we definitely look at Edage as a wonderful contemporary example. I wish I could find a way to put some of these links in the chat. I should have thought of that beforehand. But if there are people who are interested in looking at examples that are out there in the north, there is a wonderful website, Conservation through Reconciliation Initiative, I think. Anyways, they have more or less a beautiful bibliography, you could say, of all the different sources and types of Indigenous-led protected areas that exist. And in some cases in Canada, they're even looking at what those rights are, how those rights can be given back to the land. And that's kind of a newer concept in Canada. It definitely isn't in other areas of the world, but that's something that you're seeing being explored out east with the Magpie River, for example. And I guarantee you we're going to be seeing and having more of those conversations in the north about what rights does the land have, and it's speaking for itself, and how can we help support the land in what it needs, and knowing that that's what we also need. So lots of wonderful conversations being had, I think, in Canada right now around this topic, and it's definitely good to look at examples around the world to find a way to create an existence in the north that makes sense for the north, because we all can acknowledge that in the north, things are a bit different than on the Pacific coast, for example, and protected areas will look different too. So I would definitely say there's some good examples out there in a northern context for sure. Oh, thanks, Rhiannon, for putting that in the chat.
Thanks very much, Gillian.
Thanks, Andrew. Oh, go ahead, Gillian.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm just going to quickly put our website in the chat here too. We are definitely looking for any and all support from people, and you can actually sign our letter of support. And it's a helpful way to stand in solidarity with the Kaska on what we're trying to achieve. And back to what Chris was saying about the Yukon context, the Kaska in the Yukon actually have 2 proposals as well. So altogether, our nation has 3 IPCA proposals, and they all connect to each other, obviously, both physically, but also in other ways as well. So I definitely hope that people can look at those and see what it means and how it resonates in the work that any of you may be doing, and how we can all align our thinking around such an important topic.
Thanks so much, Gillian. I think we might have a question. Ren, did you have a question? I see your video came on.
I did. Yeah, thank you. Gillian, are you working with Joe Copperjack as well?
I know him. Yes,
Okay.
but no, I'm not working with him. No, but we definitely know him as a practitioner in the land relationship model for sure.
Okay, I think he's mentioned your name before. And I was just thinking about for example, like Russell Burns from Kwanlin is partnering with the Yukon First Nation Education Directorate to form a land trust for ongoing like land-based education on the family trap line that's now been protected in this particular way or acknowledged in this particular way. And it's obviously like maybe a smaller parcel of land, but I'm wondering if small or sort of protected or acknowledged land trusts and things like that also play into some of this vision for Indigenous protected and conserved areas, or if that's something that you're seeing as well, people sort of acknowledging and holding space for these cultural spaces that are also conservation areas in some way.
That's a good point. Talking about, scale and vitality, it doesn't need to be big for it to be something that we should be pushing for and supporting. And the one that comes to mind that isn't very big in terms of size, but is a proposal that is very much centered on conservation around a species, is what the Gitniao are trying to do with the Meziadin Lake region. And it's very rooted in just protecting this key salmon watershed and all the abundance of life that connects to that. And in the terms of scale, it's quite small compared to the other IPCAs, but it's equally as valuable because it's part of their cultural storehouse of knowledge and life. And so I think what you're saying, Ren, is it connects to that too. It doesn't need to be these big proposals, but these certain areas that are important to the communities in terms of protection. And even though ours is one large area, there are obviously really important components within that area that we want to make sure are protected. But we know for those areas to be integral, we have to make sure it's all protected. So yeah, it's good to kind of think of it as different ways of looking at communities' visions, and if there's something around trapline protection and all of that, that's definitely tied into IPCAs as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Ren. We probably have time for one more question or comment if anyone else wants to join in the discussion. There were a couple of thank yous to you, Gillian, in the chat there. Did you have anything you wanted to say to sort of wrap things up today?
Sure. Yeah, no, it sounds good. Just a big thank you, a heartfelt thanks for letting me have the opportunity, Rhiannon, to share something that's very, very close to my heart, as well as many of the people I work with. And it's so meaningful to us to be able to share our vision. And so I'm grateful to you all for listening and taking part in that. And if you ever have questions or curious about the conversations being had around Denikaya and Dene Kusān, I'm here. So find a way maybe to link in contact info somehow. But yeah, show us in law. Thank you. Do me good.
And thank you so much, Gillian. We were honored to have you launch this brand new speaker series. And I think this is a fantastic topic to get the speaker series started, and amazing, especially for our staff and faculty and students who joined us today. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you again for our future speaker series talks.